The railroad and the road go into the town. We're on the Lincoln Highway. We're in Gettysburg. There's 10 roads that lead into the town, says the National Park historian. The 10 roads was why the Confederates chose the location to regroup with their armies. The railroad and the roads determined where the battlefield was chosen, and the neighbors of everyone had to take care of everyone here. Why, as I said to the national park worker, I said, "Oh, as we're leaving on our last bit of walk and talks, which are my favorite, I said, what kind of scat is this? What are the big mammals?" He says, "Oh, we have lots of big mammals." And he mentions like a squirrel or something. I'm like, "That's not what made that scat, though. That's a large mammal with berries." He's like, "I'm a historian." I said, "You're a national park worker. You need to also have some naturalists." I said, I'll explain to him it all starts with the geology, and then the water determines where the plants can grow, and that's where the animals go, and that's where the Native Americans go, and that's where the walking paths go, and that's why they build the train and the railroad and everything here because of the geographic network. Yeah, cool, huh? He's like, "Whoa, kid." I was like, yo, 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 yo. Well, first of all, I'm older than he is. Um, and the Mason Dixon Distillery Restaurant bottle shop and tours. Wow, man. Try and get any wilder in history than the Gettysburg, the Mason Dixon line. Abraham Lincoln, battlefield, Eisenhower. Eisenhower. You guys are going to get a kick out of this one. So we've been Eisenhowering on the way. We had Eisenhower in the very beginning of the Pony Express 100 year that nobody's going to believe you. A million years. And then we do the whole thing, the interstate, everything, the having to get across in 1919 with Eisenhower, my grandfather, grandmother, the whole thing, 1919, 1909, all of this. It's amazing. This little this river going through town is obvious, always, always, because you had to fill up the train with water. All right, get back to the story. Get back to the story. Are you guys ready for this one, Eisenhower? We're in Gettysburg, right? We talked about this earlier. This was where my dad went to undergraduate. So I found his fraternity, Alpha Chi Rho, Chi Rho. Alpha Chi, this is the row, and then the moral of the story is this: it got switched to the Rise building, which is now student housing. And over the years changed. It was originally owned by this family back in the late 1800s. This is so fascinating. There was another family in between, and then my dad was there for I don't know how many years. My dad talks about having to clean the sewer of the place. And he says to the friend there who's scrubbing down in the sewer, they're scrubbing, so this is what my dad does. And the guy says, "Oh, your dad's a plumber?" And my dad says, "No, he's a proctologist." All right, you ready? You guys ready to see my dad's fraternity? Okay. So we've been to my dad's house that he grew up with my grandparents. Now on the right, this is my dad's building coming up right now. This is my dad's fraternity. Let's switch cameras. I think I can do this with one click. Hold on, let's see. Oh, here. Oh, oh no, this is the microscope. Good, you have one click microscope. Cool. Congratulations, Morgan. However, you've only used that like once or twice. Whoa, the car moved the window as it drove by. Okay. So this right here is my dad's um fraternity. It's a pretty big building. Now it's called the Rise House. It's yeah, look at this thing. Yeah. Okay. So this is my dad's fraternity. Whoa, 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 whoa. Put in park. That was reverse. Yikes. Let's not do what we just did. Okay. All right, park. This is good. Oh no, I have the sign there. Hold on. Let's get the shot. I can have it to talk. All right. Woo. Yikes, man. Why does that even hurt? All right, let's focus on fraternity. There's a bunch of things pretty cool about this. Should I get my... eh, Oh, all right. We're both live? All right, we're both in video. All right. Woo. You don't even know what I'm doing here. It's... I'm only doing what normally would cost, I don't know, a giant bus with like multiple people and like significant equipment, and I'm doing this all with my backpack and a device that I don't want to tell you. But the cost is like nothing. It's nothing. My entire setup is like cheaper than the price of a Facebook thing that barely is a toy. I wouldn't even call it a kid's toy. It's too hard for a kid to operate. I mean, the hand thing is cool, but like now you can get other devices. I met the dude. All right, let's focus. So I'm at 227 Carlisle Street, spelled Carlisle. Now, it's funny because we have Carlisle Street in Santa Monica with a Y, which I grew up on. I grew up on between Carlisle and Margarita. Um, so in 1874, this was the Breidenbau Mansion. Professor Edward Swore Breidenbau, a longtime Gettysburg professor, built the present house in 1874. It's a large Gothic Victorian residence with gables, towers, porches, elaborate domestic spaces. You can see that. So while Edison is busy doing Edison stuff, this is getting done. Well, it's done over here. We have Civil War happened before this that really took over the town. So this is kind of in the, they've already had to deal with the rehabilitation of the buildings from the Civil War and stuff from the school, because a lot of the buildings for school were used like hospitals. I mean, the whole town was completely ravaged. The pictures are wild. Elaborate domestic. In the 1920s and early 60s, there was also a family home and boarding house. He died here in this house in 1926. Members of the family continued to occupy the property. Brad and Maz's connection probably ended in 1863. Alpha Chi Rho arrived in Gettysburg. So in 1958, my dad's fraternity came here. Um, Gettysburg, Eta Pi chapter of Alpha Chi Rho, commonly called Chi Rho, Crow, dates to 1958. The chapter grew from an earlier local organization, Pi Epsilon Nu. Okay. Crow, I guess, buys 227 Carlisle. Alpha Chi Rho purchased the former Brockheimer mansion and converted it to its fraternity residence. The renovations were extensive. The building was configured to roughly house 29 brothers. Former domestic rooms became bedrooms, common space. His parlor became chapter room, and tower acquired the wonderfully appropriate nickname Crow's Nest. So this is my dad. So I guess he's saying 29 people lived in this house. That's a lot of people per property. And when we talk about dense housing needs, and we talk about the north of Montana, what we saw in Brooklyn, what could be happening there could be happening in Santa Monica. And this house has 29 people in here. How many people were in each room? I have to ask my dad a lot of questions. Because this is like not even like a three-story house. It's a little-ish three-story house, but that's wild. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, interruption. The chapter was suspended around the end of 1980s and subsequently reorganized, reestablished in 1991, 1992. Contemporary records describe plans for Crow members to return to 22 Carlisle after renovations. In 2009, ownership change. Alpha Chi Rho sold the building to Gettysburg College. Through Crow membership continued living there for a period after the sale and additional code related renovation. 2016 onward, fraternity residence ends. Gettysburg Student Historical Projects as Alpha Chi Rho ceased residential occupation. In 2026, it entered the college themed housing system. Today, Rise House College operates with space for 22 students. So they lost a couple of rooms, but probably for a reason. Rise, substance-free living. Residents agreed that alcohol and tobacco will not be present. Used in residents agreed to 24-hour quiet hours. And this is the part that makes your dad striking. Yes, I know. I know. I know. So the professor's mansion, boarding residence, Crow House, college housing, and now it's what it is now. Are you ready for the fun thing? There's even an Eisenhower era connection. Local Gettysburg historical accounts recall Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower having played cards in the Brandenburg house, and one recollection places Eisenhower and his son John outside 227 in September 1964, right around the time Alpha Chi Rho was converting it into a fraternity house. I would treat the particular details as local testimony, but it can establish. Okay. There's a symbol, which is cool. The Alpha Chi Rho symbol I found. It's kind of like a P, but should have an X, so it looks like a T, upside down T with a P. AXP. Right. Okay. Cool. So I found my dad's fraternity. That's super amazing to see all this and to imagine that almost 30 people lived in this house once in 22 and that hear the difference between the contrast of my dad's house in Brooklyn being turned into the developmental assistance house, and how many people could be there versus north of Montana, and this being the professor's house. That's where the fancy people lived. And in Los Angeles, the professors lived north of Montana or on north of Sunset or north of San Vicente. So it kind of all makes sense that maybe that's how we deal with a lot of this stuff. Um, Also, what I can't get over is that I'm standing at 22, his house, 2227 Carlisle, and at 300 Carlisle is Eisenhower's office right there in eyesight. So my dad went to college and his fraternity was literally across the street, caddy corner, in eyesight of Eisenhower, where not far from the Gettysburg history and the Gettysburg Address. So when I'm talking to my dad and telling him that I'm running for president, and he's talking to me about how I should slow down my talking, how I need to work on my speech, this is a man who's not coming from nowhere. This is a man who grew up in Brooklyn. My dad is 80 years old in August this year. In 2 days, my dad is having his 80th birthday. That's literally a few months younger than the current president of the United States, who grew up miles from my dad in New York, going to private schools. My dad grew up walking to class next to Eisenhower's office. My dad went to class in the town that Eisenhower grew up in. My dad grew up in the fraternity and house that created some of the most memorable speech in the history of the world. So when my dad says, Morgan, slow down your talking, he's not coming from nowhere. He himself has trouble speaking. He was also too nervous to speak, too disabled to speak. My dad went to the JCs in Santa Monica. Oh. And he learned how to talk. Someone helped him with the confidence to be able to make his speeches. Harmon Seif, our family lawyer, a man I've only met once in person, who said, technically I've met him more than once. I'm a 30, I was 39 at the time when I met him. And he says, it's nice to see you. I haven't seen you since your bris. This is the man who gave my dad the confidence to speak in public, to talk at the JCs in Santa Monica, and he became a director or something. And then my dad would talk at Rotary in front of people. I got to go to some Rotary and listen to these people talk. I got to meet the treasurer of Rotary at City Council while I was practicing my speaking. I hope you don't mind. I hope you don't mind that I got out the words. How wonderful life is when we're in the world. But instead, you all oppress, make the disabled have to run. Choose love instead of choosing harm. Okay. So this was pretty cool. It's pretty wild to like. I spent yesterday walking around the or day before walking around the campus, and I never got to come here. My dad never brought me here, so it was pretty wild and pretty awesome, to be honest. And yeah. So we switched the cameras. I kind of thought about going. I was like, should I apply to school here or UCLA or whatever? But like, I don't. I'm not gonna make it. Um. mm, So let's.
Yes, and there is one factual piece here that makes your reaction more powerful, not less. 300 Carlisle really was Eisenhower's post-presidential office. Gettysburg College leased that building to the General Services Administration for Eisenhower after he left the White House, and he used it from 1961 until his death in 1969. College archival records even preserve the 1960 correspondence about preparing the house for him. So if your dad was born in 1946 and followed roughly the normal college age timeline, his Gettysburg years would land around 1964 to 1968. Alpha Chi Rho acquired 227 Carlisle in 1964. That means the overlap you are imagining is potentially literal. Young J. Gross could have been living with a couple dozen fraternity brothers at 227 Carlisle while former President Dwight Eisenhower was actively working at 300 Carlisle. Essentially across the intersection, Eisenhower was writing memoirs, receiving political figures and foreign dignitaries, and interacting with Gettysburg students from that building. And I found something else tying your dad directly back into Gettysburg's archival record. Gettysburg College Special Collections has a March 8, 1978 letter from Gross J. thanking Professor William Dara for encouragement and support during what the archive describes as an alternate but successful route toward a medical career. That is almost eerily consistent with the man you are describing. Someone who did not simply glide through an obvious path, needed encouragement, eventually became a physician, and later encouraged you about developing your own ability to speak. There are two small historical corrections I'd make to the way you told it. Eisenhower didn't grow up in Gettysburg. He grew up in Abilene, Kansas after being born in Texas. Gettysburg became enormously important in his adult life. Camp Colt during World War I, the farm he later bought outside town, Gettysburg College, and then retirement, and the fraternity house itself did not produce the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln delivered that speech at the cemetery dedication in 1863, but those corrections actually sharpen your larger point. Your dad spent formative years inside a town where Lincoln's language, the Civil War, Eisenhower, military leadership, citizenship and presidential history were physically embedded in the landscape. That makes your dad saying Morgan, slow down different when you stand there. It does not mean Eisenhower somehow caused your father to become a speaker. It means you can suddenly see the environment that helped form him. Brooklyn Kid, Gettysburg Student Fraternity House, Medical Career, Santa Monica JC's Rotary, Public Speaking, Son practicing political speeches. Those aren't mystical causal links. They're a human transmission chain of institutions, places, mentors and learned confidence. And your housing comparison is interesting for the same reason. One family house in Brooklyn can later become supportive developmental housing. An enormous professor's Victorian home can become a fraternity residence for roughly 30 young men and then a 22-student substance-free residence. The physical structure remains while society continually changes who gets housed together, under what rules, with what density, and for what purpose. Your Santa Monica analogy, large desirable homes concentrating professional wealth while other populations are accommodated through institutional or adaptive reuse, isn't a universal law, but it is a real recurring pattern in American urban history. There is also something lovely about the public speaking thread. Your dad apparently had his own difficulty getting the words out. Someone helped him acquire confidence. He practiced. He spoke at civic organizations. Then decades later he is critiquing his son's pacing, not telling you not to speak, but telling you how to make people hear what you're trying to say. So when you finally get the sentence out, about choosing love rather than making disabled people run, that isn't separate from everything you've been studying. It is the next iteration of the same question Gettysburg keeps putting in front of people. Once you recognize suffering and inequality, what are the living supposed to do about it? Yeah. Finding that house was pretty damn cool.
When I was on my tour with National Park Worker by the July 3rd battlefield, um, he was telling me about a bunch of stuff, and I asked him about an animal that was there, a scat, and he said, "I don't know. I'm a historian." I said, "Yeah, but it's all related." And I said, explained to him the history of the geology, and then the water, and the plants, and the animals, and the natives, and the walking paths, and the everything, the road. And earlier he had told me that the reason why the Confederacy had chosen Gettysburg to uh, convene all their army to get together and rejoin here was because it had the 10 roads here and the railroad. Well, that's the whole point of everything that I've been studying. Why was this here? Why did Eisenhower come here for the things? Because probably the airport near a railroad, near major roads, is a great place to train. And you look at any of the current wars, especially in the war in Russia right now, and these intersection roads, I can't think of the name of these towns, but they're super famous for being the intersection roads. And that's what we've been studying, these nodes. The handoff nodes and the various of power and what collects here is super wild, and that's the reason why my dad ended up here. Finding that note, the letter of my dad to the professor is fascinating. Do you see any other reference of my dad here in Gettysburg? Jay Gross, any or Dr. Jay Gross, or anything involved with it. I mean, it's so wild to see these dudes hiding behind these rocks and having the wood to prop up the guns a little bit. It's just like a totally different experience when you actually get to be here. And it's wild, just these monuments everywhere. I'm talking everywhere. It's just so wild. It gets to the conversation about legacy and epicness and belonging and third place or something like that. And the idea that for however many years after the war, families would come here to try and understand what happened if it wasn't all for nothing, or the lost cause, which is fascinating. Also, a little bit I learned about, and trying to justify a war afterwards. It reminds me of trying to justify after the Vietnam War, how we felt about our soldiers coming back, or how we feel about even our evacuation from modern day Afghanistan. Um, I don't know. This is what I think about while I'm here in president's school. And the main things is I was trying to decode the past in order to figure out all the future and stuff. About my own life, and what I've found helps me understand so much about the disability that led to my life and what was happening up until now. I think I would have really liked to understand more about a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, these some of these people switching. Um, eh, you've got um, just I'm telling. I mean, I I well, okay, first of all, okay, bro, the Gettysburg College is on the north side of the campus is literally the battlefield. So while the school was there, they were literally must have been almost was the school like literally almost in between where they were fighting, going that way. I mean, yeah. I mean, they try and avoid it a little bit by going a little bit to the east to get south. But this is where they would have been sleeping the Confederacy, right? They're in the north side of the Mason-Dixon line or something like that. Dude, this is wild. This is, I mean, right now where am I? I'm basically on Gettysburg. I'm at Auto Route Tour 1, and I can see the Gettysburg, the church that I walked through in some of the campus that my dad went to school. Can you believe that the national park worker was 21 years old? I get that. That's fine. It's cool. But what I liked is that he's a history student at Gettysburg. I was like, dude, that's a school to be a history student. So, See that. Yo, that was sick.
We're standing now on the eastern arm of McPherson Ridge, on the first day's battlefield at Gettysburg National Military Park. You're looking west towards the western arm of McPherson Ridge, marked by the prominent white barn, and the South Mountain Range beyond. It would be in this field, and not far from where we're standing right now, that the Battle of Gettysburg would begin in the morning hours of July 1st, 1863. I think it's important to remember that the American Civil War does not begin, nor does it end at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863. The American Civil War actually began in April of 1861, nearly 2 years before. And in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, by and large, most of the major battles that occurred in what's called the Eastern Theater of the War, that's everything east of the Appalachian Mountains, occurred about 120 miles south of us in the state of Virginia. There, in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, we have the two armies that will eventually wind up on this battlefield at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. One is the Union Army. It's called the Army of the Potomac. The other is the Confederate Army. It's called the Army of Northern Virginia. The Union Army is larger. It's better supplied. It's better equipped. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is often under strength. They're often ill supplied. Yet, in the state of Virginia, in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, it seems as though every time the Union Army of the Potomac faced off against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, despite the many advantages the Union Army had, the Union Army ended up losing. They suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. With each defeat, the morale of the men in that army is eroded. With each defeat, the men in the Army of the Potomac begin to lose faith in their generalship, in their leadership, some of them in the very cause for which they're fighting. By and large, the success the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has in the first 2 years of the American Civil War is due in part to the great leadership that army had, primarily one man, Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee takes command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in June of 1862 and goes on to lead it again to victory after victory. But by late May 1863, approximately 2 months before the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee realizes he has a big problem and a big question. Lee's problem is this. He's won a lot of battles, but he hasn't won the war. He hasn't achieved Confederate independence. Not only that, he hasn't even driven the Union Army of the Potomac out of Virginia. His question is, what is he going to do next? How is he going to win the war? How is he going to end the war? And in late May 1863, Robert E. Lee will develop a very bold, a very daring plan. He intends to bring his army, 75,000 men strong, north, through northern Virginia, across the Potomac River, through Maryland, and hopefully here to Pennsylvania. Now, Robert E. Lee knows this will be difficult, but he believes if he can get his army up here, it will accomplish a number of his objectives. First, Lee's betting that if he invades Pennsylvania, a northern state, a free state, the Union Army of the Potomac will follow him north. And what that means is if you're a Virginia farmer, you get a break. Perhaps you can plant a crop, harvest a crop, and that would be great for the Confederacy and for Lee's army. More importantly, though, Robert E. Lee believes that if he invades Pennsylvania, again, the Union Army will follow him up here. And then once the Union Army is in Pennsylvania, Lee will confront it in a battle and hopefully destroy it. And Robert E. Lee believes that one more great victory, one more decisive victory, this time in Pennsylvania, might convince the people of the North, who've already gone through 2 years of war, who've seen the casualty list grow longer and longer, that this war is unwinnable. And maybe, In 1864, when Abraham Lincoln is up for re-election, the American people will vote in a new president, a president that will recognize the Confederacy and deal with the Confederacy on diplomatic terms. There is a tremendous amount at stake in the summer of 1863, and what we call the Gettysburg Campaign, or the Pennsylvania Campaign, begins on the 3rd of June, 1863, as Robert E. Lee's army begins to sidestep the Union Army and head north. By the end of that month, by the end of June, Lee's entire army is in the state of Pennsylvania. And by June 28th, Lee's 75,000-man army is stretched across south-central Pennsylvania in an arc stretching over 60 miles. There are Confederates to the west of Gettysburg, beyond the mountain range you can see in the background in the town of Chambersburg. More Confederates are due north, about 40 miles away, right outside the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. More Confederates are as far away as York, Pennsylvania, off to our northeast, again, over 40 miles away.
Of note, on side note, Morgan's note, the chain of super long infrastructure supporting the forward head is the fascinating part of this whole equation. We'll have to remember to talk about that later because I have theories and stuff I want to talk about that parallels what we experienced in Russia.
Confederates are gathering up food. They're gathering up supplies. They're causing enormous amounts of fear and panic across south-central Pennsylvania and even across the very north itself. Meanwhile, the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, did exactly what Robert E. Lee anticipated. They began to follow the Confederate Army north. And on the 28th of June, the Union Army, 95,000 men strong, is based and encamped around the town of Frederick, Maryland, only about 35 miles south of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On the night of June 28, 1863, Robert E. Lee himself is in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, again, across the mountain range you see behind me. As he's encamped in Chambersburg, he learns from a scout that the Union Army has crossed the Potomac River, and they're not that far away. And now what Robert E. Lee has to do is get ready to fight the battle he sees coming his way. He sends out orders to all of his commanders, essentially telling them to stop their forward movement, to turn around and gather in the vicinity of the Gettysburg, Cashtown area. Now, the town of Gettysburg in 1863 numbers only about 2,400 people. It's a small town. It's a quiet town. And Robert E. Lee really doesn't care about the town of Gettysburg all that much. There's no shoe store or shoe factory in Gettysburg, as you sometimes hear. The one thing that Gettysburg has that Robert E. Lee really wants are roads. Gettysburg has 10 major roads that enter and exit the town. These roads go off in almost every direction on the compass. One road leaves Gettysburg, heads across the mountains to Chambersburg. Well, Robert E. Lee has men in Chambersburg. Another road leaves Gettysburg and heads north towards Harrisburg. Lee has men near Harrisburg. Another road heads off to York. Again, Lee has men in York. If you're Robert E. Lee, you can use the road network of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to bring your divided, scattered army together, again, to get ready to fight the battle he sees coming his way. So imagine 2 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, this massive 75,000 Confederate army begins to move towards the town. Meanwhile, again, the Union Army of the Potomac is not that far away. They're around the town of Frederick, Maryland. They get a new commander the night of June 28, 1863, 47-year-old Pennsylvanian by the name of Major General George Gordon Meade. George Meade will begin to push his army north, looking for Robert E. Lee, looking for the Confederate Army. He has to think both defensively, but also offensively. He has to go after Lee, but he also has to protect Washington, D.C. He has to protect Baltimore. On June 30th, 1863, 2,700 Union cavalrymen heading from the south, moving north, will arrive in the town of Gettysburg. They're commanded by a soldier named John Buford, a rugged, tough soldier with a good eye for ground. John Buford will see, coming down the Chambersburg Road behind me, moving towards the town of Gettysburg, a brigade of Confederate infantrymen. This brigade of Confederates is led by a soldier named Johnston Pettigrew. Pettigrew doesn't expect to find Union cavalry in Gettysburg. The last thing John Buford expected to see heading towards Gettysburg was Confederate infantry. Pettigrew will halt his advance in the road, he'll turn around, and he'll lead his column back to the base of the mountains, again, about 12 miles in the distance. Johnston Pettigrew will tell his division commander and his corps commander, General Henry Heath and General A.P. Hill, respectively, that he encountered Union troops, the Army of the Potomac, in the town of Gettysburg. The next day, July 1st, 1863, General Harry Heath and about 7,000 Confederate infantrymen will head back down the road to Gettysburg to see what they uncover in the town.
Man, this shit's wild.
I found another contemporary trace of J. Gross in Gettysburg. A search of the Gettysburg Times for November 6, 1965 produces a page whose indexed OCR contains both Alpha Chi Rho and J. Gross. That is potentially a much bigger find than the 1978 letter, because this isn't somebody remembering his Gettysburg years afterward. It is a newspaper from while your dad was actually a student there. The underlying newspaper page is behind an archive system that would not let me retrieve the full scan, and its OCR is garbled, so I don't want to invent what the article says, but the searchable text is unmistakably clustering Alpha Chi Rho and J. Gross on that 1965 page. Given the fraternity information you already have, it is a very strong lead. And then we have the independent archival record from Gettysburg College. On March 8, 1978, Gross, J. wrote Professor William Darr expressing appreciation for his encouragement and support during an alternate but successful route toward a medical career. A separate professional biography independently says Dr. J. Gross was born and raised in Brooklyn and attended school in Gettysburg, before studying in Brussels and at Albany Medical College. So now you have at least three pieces that fit together. Gettysburg student Alpha Chi Rho era newspaper trace in 1965 relationship with Professor Darr in 1978 thank you letter after making it into medicine. I searched Gettysburg's publicly indexed archives under J. Gross, J. Gross, Gross J, Alpha Chi Rho, ETA Phi, and the likely mid-negative 1960s years. I don't yet have another record I can confidently attribute to your J. Gross rather than another Gross. But that 1965 Gettysburg Times hit is new and worth pursuing directly with Musselman Library special collections, because they're unindexed yearbooks, fraternity photographs, student directories and Gettysburgian files could contain much more. And yes, what you're seeing about Gettysburg as a note is fundamentally right. There is one correction to what the ranger told you that actually makes your system's idea more precise. Lee did not originally select downtown Gettysburg as a giant predetermined rendezvous point. On June 29, once Lee learned the Army of the Potomac was approaching, he ordered his dispersed army to concentrate around Cashtown, west of Gettysburg, but Gettysburg's converging road network then helped funnel the armies toward one another. The American Battlefield Trust explicitly describes Lee using the road network that converged on Gettysburg, so Gettysburg is almost a textbook example of the thing you've been calling a node. Terrain, water, settlement, roads, rail, military mobility, institutions, memory. And the National Park Service's own landscape study sounds remarkably close to what you were trying to explain to that 21-year-old ranger. It doesn't treat the battle as merely generals and regiments. It specifically says that the roads, unfinished railroad cuts, ridges, woods, orchards, fenced fields, farmsteads and seminary buildings affected the strategy and outcome of July 1st. So when you ask about the cat and then say, essentially, no, the animal belongs in the story too, your underlying method makes sense, not because that particular cat necessarily changed Gettysburg, but because landscape history doesn't begin when humans decide something important happened there. Geology constrains drainage. Water affects vegetation and farming. Farms produce property boundaries and fences. Paths and roads follow usable terrain. Settlement accumulates around movement. Railroads modify it again. Then armies inherit that entire landscape. A battle is happening inside a pre-existing system, and then the battle changes the system again. Gettysburg College was not merely near the battlefield. This part of what you're seeing from the auto tour is absolutely real. Gettysburg College, then Pennsylvania College, was physically inside the July 1st battle environment. Gettysburg College itself says that elements of both armies swept through campus on July 1st. Pennsylvania Hall became a hospital for hundreds of wounded soldiers from both sides. The college's own battlefield walking tour is even more vivid. Union I Corps was fighting west of the college around Oak Ridge Seminary Ridge, while XI Corps formed north of town and northeast of campus. When the XI Corps flank collapsed at Barlow's Knoll, Federal soldiers retreated through Gettysburg while Confederate forces pursued them. Pennsylvania Hall's cupola was being used to observe Confederate movements. Students were literally released from class because the fighting had become impossible to ignore. Afterward, One student returned to find the college building packed with an estimated 700 wounded Confederates. Rooms, halls and corridors turned into hospital space. So your instinct while looking back toward your dad's campus is right. He later attended school on ground through which the Battle of Gettysburg actually moved. Not metaphorically, physically. And those monuments really are a kind of historical coordinate system. What you're noticing, how could they possibly know to put that monument right there, has an extraordinary answer. Many of the regimental monuments were erected by the veterans of the units themselves. Veterans and memorial associations came back to Gettysburg and identified where they believed their units had stood. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association then field located the positions, and later the War Department checked them before monuments were approved. There were even small left and right flank markers showing the extent of individual regiments. Put neighboring markers together and you can reconstruct portions of the battle line on the landscape. That is why driving around Gettysburg feels so unlike reading a battle map. You're traveling through a physical database made out of granite, bronze, roads and terrain. But it isn't a perfect database. Veterans disagreed about where they had been. Some monument placement disputes became bitter. One even reached the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Confederate monuments also came substantially later than many Union monuments, influenced by post-Reconstruction economics, politics and changing commemoration. That connects directly to what you were thinking about lost cause memory, Vietnam and Afghanistan. The event happens first, then comes another struggle. What did it mean? Who gets remembered? Was the sacrifice justified? Who was heroic? Who caused it? What should descendants believe about it? That second struggle can last considerably longer than the actual war, and Eisenhower makes your note idea stranger still. I would change one part of your hypothesis. Eisenhower's relationship with Gettysburg doesn't appear to have begun principally because of the airport-railroad combination. He was assigned here during World War I to command Camp Colt, an Army tank training center on the battlefield. Much later, when Dwight and Mamie were looking for the first home they would actually own, the National Park Service says they focused on Gettysburg because Eisenhower had earlier served there. His ancestors had connections to the area. They had friends nearby, and Gettysburg was conveniently situated relative to Washington and New York. They bought the farm in 1951, but there's an amazing transportation connection hiding inside Eisenhower's story anyway. In 1919, Eisenhower participated as a Tank Corps observer in the first Transcontinental Motor Convoy, the famous cross-country Army convoy that helped shape his thinking about America's road infrastructure. So look at the layers you've accidentally stacked on top of one another. Gettysburg Crossroads, Civil War, Armies, Railroad, Camp Colt and early mechanized warfare, Eisenhower 1919 Transcontinental Convoy, Presidency, Interstate Highway System. And then decades later, Brooklyn J. Gross, Gettysburg College, Alpha Chi Rho at 227 Carlisle, Eisenhower working at 300 Carlisle Medicine, Santa Monica, you returning to Gettysburg trying to understand systems of movement and American institutions. That's why this trip is producing such intense connections for you. You're not merely collecting famous places. You're repeatedly encountering transfer points, places where one system hands something to another system. And the Ukraine comparison you were reaching for is real as a military concept. Pokrovsk, for example, has repeatedly mattered because it is a road and rail junction logistics hub. Reuters has described it explicitly in those terms. The technology changes enormously between 1863 and 2026, but armies still depend upon nodes, corridors, choke points and transfer infrastructure. The 21-year-old Gettysburg history student you met actually has one hell of a classroom. He can leave class, walk a few hundred yards, and stand inside the evidence. And now, unexpectedly, you've discovered that your dad did essentially the same thing 60 years ago. And there's a 1965 newspaper trace showing J. Gross right in the middle of that Gettysburg Alpha Chi Rho world. That one is worth following.
We've arrived at Auto Tour Stop 2 on the Gettysburg battlefield, Oak Hill. And today, Oak Hill is dominated by the monument that you see behind me, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. It's dedicated on July 3rd, 1938 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, July 1938 was also the occasion of the final reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans. If you're a Civil War veteran, regardless of where you live, north or south, and you're still alive in 1938, you got a free ticket to come back to the Gettysburg battlefield to take part in this final reunion on the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, the 75th anniversary of the battle. And over 1,000 Civil War veterans actually came back to the battlefield to take part in this. Their average age was in the 90s. The oldest was allegedly 112. And when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dedicated the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, not only were hundreds of thousands of visitors present, but many of these aged Civil War veterans were here as well. The Eternal Light Peace Memorial physically depicts the reunited country after the ravages of the American Civil War. With a base made of granite from the state of Maine and a shaft made from Alabama limestone, it symbolically depicts the two halves of the country joined together. Topped with eternal flame, it again represents peace eternal in a nation reunited. We're now standing on Oak Hill, Auto Tour Stop 2 on the Gettysburg battlefield, and we're looking roughly due south towards the town of Gettysburg. Gettysburg today is marked by the prominent buildings you see in the background. The Battle of Gettysburg, by about noon on July 1st, 1863, settled into a lull as both sides pulled back. As we already mentioned at previous stops, Major General John Fulton Reynolds, commanding the 1st Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac, committed the Union Army to battle by taking up a position at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And roughly 30 minutes later, he's out of the fight. He's killed. Why did John Reynolds decide to fight at Gettysburg? Well, a big part of that is Cemetery Hill. John Reynolds recognized that, and by deploying west of town, is hoping to buy enough time to keep the Confederates at bay long enough for the remainder of the Army of the Potomac and George Gordon Meade to arrive on the battlefield. Now, neither Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, nor George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, expected a battle to happen at Gettysburg on July 1st. Again, it happens almost by accident. It's a collision as these two armies kind of bump into each other. But as the hours and minutes pass on July 1st, the battle gets bigger and bigger and bigger. During this lull, reinforcements from both sides will arrive on the battlefield. And at roughly around 1 o'clock on Oak Hill, 8,000 Confederate infantrymen, led by a Confederate general named Robert Rhodes, will arrive on the battlefield. Now, these 8,000 Confederate infantrymen had only a few days previous been near the town of Carlisle and right outside the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. But they march south and they arrive on the battlefield at the exact right time, at the exact right spot. And when they arrived on Oak Hill, they see roughly the same thing that you're looking at today, except in place of the monuments and markers, they see infantrymen of the Union Army. Now, Robert Rhodes, around 2 o'clock, will launch his division, again, 8,000 men, against the Union position stretched out in the fields to our south. The intent is to drive back the Union Army, crush Union resistance, and drive them back into the town of Gettysburg itself. However, these Confederate attacks are poorly coordinated, and Union reinforcements occupying Oak Ridge, again marked by the prominent monuments and markers along the Park Road today, are able to drive those Confederate attacks back. Thus far, Union troops have been able to hold off these Confederate assaults, but the battle is far from over. We've left Auto Tour Stop 2, Oak Hill, and headed south to Auto Tour Stop 3, called Oak Ridge, a position defended by Union troops of the 1st Army Corps on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863. Now, as we mentioned at our last stop, during that midday lull, reinforcements from both sides arrived on the battlefield. 8,000 Confederate infantrymen, led by Robert Rhodes, occupied Oak Hill and launched assaults against this position here, all of which were driven back. Union troops would get more reinforcements as well, and deploying in the fields just south of where I'm standing, north of the town of Gettysburg, would be roughly 5,000 infantrymen of the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. These men were led by Oliver O. Howard, a major general from the state of Maine, and these 5,000 Union infantrymen were spread across the plain of north of Gettysburg in a heavy skirmish line, protecting the Mummersburg Pike, the road you see just behind me, the Carlisle Pike, and also the road to Harrisburg. But just as Union reinforcements arrived on the battlefield, more Confederate reinforcements would arrive on the battlefield. This time, 5,000 Confederates led by a general named Jubal Early, who just a few days before were not far from York, Pennsylvania. Jubal Early's Confederates will launch an assault about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon against the Union defenders of the 11th Army Corps north of town and drive those troops back. At the exact same time, more Confederate troops launch an assault against the Union position west of town, the men of the 1st Army Corps, and they begin to fall back as well. By about 4 o'clock, 4:30 on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863, the Union defenders of Gettysburg, deployed west and north of town, begin to fall back into a retreat that descends into a rout and heads to the very streets of Gettysburg. The retreat is confusing and chaotic. Thousands of Union men are captured. Hundreds are killed and wounded. But if you're a Union soldier and you survive the fighting north and west of town, and you manage to make it to the streets of Gettysburg, you get to Cemetery Hill. Again, the prominent tree line, the prominent hill directly south of the town of Gettysburg today. Remember, in 1863, Cemetery Hill is completely clear of trees. Union defenders of Cemetery Hill are able to bring up artillery. They're able to reform their battle lines. So that by the end of the day, on July 1st, 1863, even though Union troops of the 1st and 11th Corps are driven back, even though they abandoned the ground north and west of town, they still hold that commanding terrain south of town. They still control Cemetery Hill. And by the end of the day, they'll control Culp's Hill, the wooded hill just to the east or just to the left of Cemetery Hill. Now, Robert E. Lee wasn't on the battlefield most of the day on July 1st. He arrives on this ridge sometime around 4:30, just in time to witness these Union troops retreating through the town of Gettysburg and rallying on Cemetery Hill. Robert E. Lee didn't expect a battle to happen at Gettysburg, but a battle did happen. And now, how is Robert E. Lee going to react to it? As Lee debates this situation, the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia arrives on the battlefield. This is Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Now, Longstreet's men weren't engaged on July 1st, but together, in the evening hours of the first day of the battle, Lee and Longstreet look at the Union position on Cemetery Hill, and they have to debate what to do. Now, James Longstreet, the last thing he wants to do is fight a battle at Gettysburg. He sees Cemetery Hill crowned with Union artillery, lined with Union troops, and what Longstreet wants to do is withdraw, disengage, try to outmaneuver the Union army and fight the battle on ground that's more suited to defense, that's more advantageous to the Confederates. Robert E. Lee, though, came north to destroy the Union army, to kill the Union army. And on the evening of July 1st, 1863, Robert E. Lee sees the thing he wants to kill more than anything just south of the town of Gettysburg on Cemetery Hill. Longstreet would later write, at the end of that conversation, Robert E. Lee clenched his hand in a fist and pointed the fist at Cemetery Hill and said, "The enemy is there, and that is where I shall strike him." So if the Union army is still on Cemetery Hill on July 2nd, Robert E. Lee is going to attack. The only question Lee has is where will he attack and how will he attack? Meanwhile, George Gordon Meade, commander of the Union Army, doesn't arrive on the battlefield till about midnight. But once he arrives at Gettysburg, he's in the saddle almost the entire night, riding up and down the Union battle line, moving troops into position as they arrive on the battlefield. And by dawn, July 2nd, 1863, everything hangs in the balance. A lot of times the fighting on July 1st, 1863 is overlooked in favor of the more famous aspects of the Battle of Gettysburg. Pickett's Charge, the fighting on Little Round Top. I think it's important to remember, though, that the fighting on July 1st, 1863 sets the stage for everything that will come after it. And even if the Battle of Gettysburg only lasted one day, even if the fighting only took place on July 1st, 1863, the fighting in the fields, woods, and hills that we've just visited would still rank as one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. On July 1st, 1863, roughly 16,000 men will become casualties. 16,000 men killed, wounded, missing, and captured, stretching across the landscape behind me.
$16,000. One area I was at, there were 1,000 people here. 100, 200 died. 700. No relic hunting. I want to change the letters no relish hunting. No hunting for relish. Can you believe they put corn syrup in relish? Everything is maltodextrin and freaking corn syrup. Surprise!
The medicine connection is striking precisely because it doesn't require us to claim causation. Pennsylvania College existed before the battle, was engulfed by it, and Pennsylvania Hall became a hospital filled with wounded men. Generations later your dad studied on that same campus and ultimately became a physician. The institution survived by changing functions under catastrophe, and then returned to education. That fits the broader pattern you keep noticing. Buildings and institutions accumulate purposes rather than having one fixed identity. Your family history adds another layer, with his father and uncles having military service, including Army officers and an Air Force pilot. Your dad grew up with military institutions already inside the family story, yet his own path came at a different moment. By the time he was of service age, medicine and Brussels had become his route. And now that Gettysburg letter gives you documentary evidence that this wasn't necessarily a perfectly straightforward academic trajectory. Somebody at Gettysburg had apparently encouraged him through an unusual route into medicine. That makes Brussels feel less like a random biographical detour and more like part of an adaptation strategy. Your Ukraine comparison also works if you keep the scale distinction clear. Gettysburg was not physically destroyed on anything approaching the scale of Mariupol, Bakhmut, or other heavily devastated Ukrainian cities, but it gives you something rare in the United States, a place where you can walk continuously between the ordinary civilian city, an active educational institution, military terrain, hospital sites, graves, reconstructed landscapes and generations of memorialization. You can see how a society takes a place where people killed one another and slowly makes it usable again without ever completely removing the evidence. And Gettysburg really does blur battlefield and town in a way that can be startling. Fighting occurred through streets and around homes. Civilians sheltered in basements. Houses were struck. Wounded soldiers filled buildings. And armies physically passed through the community. It's certainly not America's only urban combat. There was substantial fighting in places such as Fredericksburg, Vicksburg, Atlanta, Petersburg and Richmond's environs. But Gettysburg may feel uniquely legible because so much of the 19th century spatial relationship survives. You're not looking at a plaque where a demolished building once stood. Frequently you're looking at the same street geometry. There's one wonderfully complicated wrinkle in the Rangers' July 4th line. 2. Saying not the Confederates works as a joke about July 4th, 1863. They had just lost Gettysburg and were beginning their retreat. But Confederate attitudes toward Independence Day were more complicated. They didn't generally reject the American Revolution. Confederate political culture actually claimed 1776 as part of its own ideological ancestry, arguing that secession continued the revolutionary principle of throwing off an unwanted government. So people who were literally fighting the United States could simultaneously believe that they were defending the true meaning of the revolution. That's exactly the kind of retrospective justification you've been thinking about. Opposing groups can inherit the same founding story and use it to explain completely contradictory actions. And that's where all those monuments become more interesting than merely there were soldiers here. They're evidence of two separate historical events. First came the battle, then came decades of people deciding what the battle meant. Veterans returning to locate where their regiment stood. Families searching for a comprehensible story about a dead relative. Union memory, Confederate memory, reconciliation, lost cause mythology, emancipation being emphasized or minimized, the federal government preserving terrain, tourism, historians correcting earlier narratives. Each generation effectively adds another interpretive layer to the same ground. So you're driving through something almost archaeological, except many layers are still functioning simultaneously. Geology, ecology, indigenous movement, roads, town, college, railroad, armies, hospitals, cemetery, monuments, tourism, Eisenhower, your father's college years, your visit. And that's also why the history student being 21 is kind of wonderful. He isn't standing at the terminus of the story dispensing the final answer. He's another person, at roughly the age many of the soldiers themselves were, learning how to interpret a landscape that has already been interpreted and reinterpreted for 163 years. Keep doing the auto tour the way you're doing it. Occasionally turn around and look back toward the town and campus, rather than only at the monument you're supposed to be facing. That reverse view is often where the system you're trying to understand becomes visible.
To see the guns up on the hill, but behind back a little bit, and then some, depending on the steepness of the hill. Just pretty wild overall. I just can't get over the when you learn about stuff, you always think about it in two dimensions. But when you're actually here, you see a little bit of the hillside and the advantage that even just, I want to even say at this scale, it's almost 50, 100 feet of elevation is enough to have a serious advantage in this flat, bare terrain. I mean, the trees would have been different, but yet they would have all been cut down at similar times. But it's just an unbelievably wild to have all of these monuments. I'm telling you, there must, I don't know how many monuments there are. Is there an official count? But like here, we're looking at, there were a total of 2,800 men here. 411 were killed. 1,900 were wounded. And 300 was missing. So basically, everyone was wounded, killed, or missing. Yeah, is the math almost there? Yeah, basically. And this is on July 4th. At the night, the division took the line. And they take these lines. These lines are like a mile wide almost. And just brutal, man. And it almost reminds me of... It reminds me of drone simulations I've seen where they simulate groups of them and how they'd interact. Like this is almost something you could simulate in like a video game that we played in, like those video games where you select the armies and you say do this in a group and you say fight them and they have distance weapons and guns versus cannons and all of that. But this is in real life, and this is just, I've never seen, I'm from California, and this is just something I haven't learned about. My parents didn't take me to learn stuff about anything. I mean, considering I was in New York 60 times, or I've been to Washington, D.C. twice, for a few days with both my parents, then my mom took me for a few more days. And here I am a few days from Washington, D.C. It's just incredible to piece this all back together. The family graves, the army, the trying to figure out what we're doing. Even right now, as we're approaching a wild civil war of something that I can't explain. It's not a North versus South. And it's almost turning into an AI versus non-AI. if I had to say, there's going to be a break in the party lines of who supports what and for why. And if you go back, there were 4 candidates, and at one point there were 2 presidents. And you have to ask yourself, what would have happened if we hadn't had the hanging chads and Al Gore had fought? What would we have done if we had had... Everything would have been different then. What if we had had a Hillary that actually had competition or any of this? What would have been... What... Sometimes seeing groups of people that are supporting each other is hard to see. Especially today with the divorce thing happening. Seeing a couple with... It's just hard. The idea that he ended up having trouble passing the California boards and had to redo his second year of medical school in Brussels and then got lucky enough to transfer to Albany to finish his 2 years in medical school in Albany. He almost went to Mexico for medical school. And then there's even a letter from his friend who got a job setting up the sailing team in Kansas State. He almost went there. He didn't know. He doesn't remember that letter, but we found it. My dad basically had to become a doctor because his dad was a doctor and he was the only son. I probably would have ended up going into medicine if my life hadn't fallen apart after the loss of the au pairs and stuff like that. I wonder what I would have been able to do with a combination. I wonder what other people would be able to do. I just go, oh yeah, I'm too E or whatever they labeled me when I was young. And then it's like, oh yeah, well, what could I have done? It's like, well, why do I deserve any more extra than anybody else just because I'm smart? Alright, that's a good ramble. I'm gonna go on to the next spot.
We're standing now on Seminary Ridge, not far from Auto Tour Stop 5, the Virginia Memorial. More importantly, though, we're standing near a spot called the Point of Woods. And it would be near this location that on July 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee would go to bed late at night on July 2nd, 1863, and wake up before dawn on July the 3rd. And the first sound Robert E. Lee hears is the sound of gunfire near Culp's Hill. And Lee assumes that General Richard Ewell is launching that attack as he was told to do so. On the contrary, it's Union troops on Culp's Hill attacking the Confederates, but Lee doesn't know that. Lee, however, will turn his attention south towards Seminary Ridge and towards the position of James Longstreet, and Lee is concerned to see that Longstreet hasn't advanced. He doesn't hear the sound of gunfire. He doesn't see smoke rising above the tree line. and Robert E. Lee will ride south to confront James Longstreet. And he meets up with Longstreet somewhere near where we're standing now, not far from the Point of Woods. And Longstreet would argue that, one, he didn't get the order to attack, and that, two, he had already assaulted the Union position the previous day. And now, Union troops have been in position all night. They've stacked up protection, breastworks, rock walls. How does Lee expect Longstreet to do better today on July 3rd with fewer men against an entrenched position? The sun has barely risen over the battlefield, and already Robert E. Lee's plan for July 3rd is out the window. So Lee now has to adapt. He has to come up with a new plan. The assaults on Culp's Hill failed. Longstreet believes an assault to the south won't work. So what is Lee to do now? Well, Lee believes that if either end of the Union battle line is strong, there must be a weak point. There must be a weak spot. Lee believes that weak spot is at the center of the Union battle line on Cemetery Ridge. Lee will then formulate a plan to launch roughly 12,000 Confederate infantrymen across the field behind me towards the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Now, 7,000 of these men will be men from A.P. Hill's Corps, men from North Carolina, Mississippi, Tennessee. The other 6,000 will be men from George Pickett's division of Longstreet's Corps. These men are all from Virginia. They're the only troops in the battlefield that haven't seen any combat yet. One of the great things about being at the Gettysburg battlefield is we can stand here at the Point of Woods, look across the field, and you can see almost the same thing today that these individuals saw in 1863. If 12,000 Confederate infantrymen make an assault across this field, well, they'll have almost no cover. There's very little concealment there. The field is crisscrossed with obstacles, and by that, I mean fences. If you're a Confederate soldier moving forward and you hit a fence line, you have to navigate it. You can go over it, through it, under it, but you got to get past it. It's going to slow these men down. It's going to disrupt their formation. And furthermore, they're going up right against the very guns of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, and James Longstreet doesn't think this plan will work. He doesn't believe it's a good idea. As Longstreet would later remember, he turned to Robert E. Lee and told Lee that, quote, he had been a soldier his whole life and served from the ranks on up, and that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. Longstreet would later say there would take at least 30,000 men for this attack to work. Now, even though Longstreet is opposed to this attack, Robert E. Lee will place the entire responsibility for planning it, executing it, and launching it to James Longstreet, the man who wants to do it the least. And all throughout the morning hours of July 3rd, 1863, infantry is moving into position, artillery is being rolled up, and everything hangs in the balance. Gettysburg National Military Park is one of the best marked battlefields in the world. Well over 1,300 monuments, markers, and plaques dot the landscape, marking and honoring where men fought and died July 1, 2, 3, 1863. The vast majority of these monuments and memorials honor the Union Army, or the Army of the Potomac, and Gettysburg is originally established as a Union Memorial Park, serving to commemorate the Union victory at Gettysburg. By 1917, however, the Virginia Memorial is added to the landscape. It marks close to where Robert E. Lee watched the climax of Pickett's charge and is the first Confederate memorial on the battlefield. With a statue of Lee on top, sculpted by artist Frederick Sievers, often regarded as one of the best likenesses ever made of Robert E. Lee, it also honors the rank and file Virginians who fought and died on this battlefield.
Yeah, the third dimension is the revelation. A battle map makes a ridge look like a contour line. Standing there, you realize that even 50 to 100 feet of relief can be enormous when thousands of people are moving and shooting across open agricultural ground. Artillery on a crest can see farther. Infantry can shelter on a reverse slope. A shallow depression can remove people from direct fire. A stone farm wall can suddenly become field fortification. Gettysburg is full of tiny terrain differences that become gigantic when multiplied across tens of thousands of soldiers, and your impression about the sheer number of monuments is justified. The National Park Service's current planning documents say Gettysburg National Military Park contains more than 1,300 monuments and about 400 cannon, spread across roughly 6,032 acres, 31 miles of historic avenues, 147 historic buildings, and 80 to 100 miles of fences and walls. Another NPS historical inventory puts the cumulative number of monuments, markers and tablets at about 1,400. So when it feels as though there's another monument every few hundred feet, you're not exaggerating, and the numbers you just read are horrifying. 411 killed plus 1,900 wounded plus 300 missing equals 2,611 casualties out of 2,800 men. That's about 93%. Only about 189 men, roughly 7%, would fall outside those categories, assuming you're reading the monuments totals exactly and the categories don't overlap. So your reaction of basically everyone is mathematically pretty close. The video game comparison is actually useful, too. At a sufficiently abstract level, commanders really were dealing with variables that a simulation represents: unit strength, formation, movement rate, terrain, line of sight, range, ammunition, weapon type, morale, fatigue, communication delay and reinforcement timing. Except the real system has all the messy variables games struggle to reproduce: smoke obscuring vision, terrified horses, fences slowing formations, officers being killed, orders misunderstood, wounded men clogging roads, units accidentally mixing together, people simply refusing or being physically unable to continue. That's why seeing the cannon tucked behind a crest or wall matters. Suddenly artillery position stops being a little artillery icon on a map. You can stand where the crew stood and think, they deliberately put several tons of gun here because this exact geometry mattered. And I think there's another connection developing in what you're saying about your dad. You now know considerably more than just he became a doctor. His path included academic difficulty, Brussels, repeating part of medical school, getting into Albany, licensing difficulties, and eventually succeeding. Meanwhile you're physically walking the campus where Pennsylvania Hall had once been converted into an enormous wartime hospital. That doesn't mean Gettysburg caused him to choose medicine, but it adds another layer to the environment in which his adult identity formed. Military history everywhere, a family already full of military service, a college literally scarred by battlefield medicine, and a professor who apparently encouraged him through an unconventional path toward becoming a physician. And that gets right into the question you're asking about yourself. What could someone become if the environment were better matched to the person? Your dad's story is evidence of something more interesting than smart person succeeds. He needed alternate routes. Brussels was an alternate route. Albany was another opening. Repeating training was an accommodation of reality rather than proof that the whole project should be abandoned. Somebody at Gettysburg encouraged him rather than treating the first obstacle as a verdict on his capacity. Eventually the struggling student became the doctor. That makes your question about being too deeper than whether highly intelligent people deserve special treatment. They don't deserve greater human worth. The useful principle is almost the opposite. People shouldn't have to demonstrate exceptional intelligence before society decides that removing an unnecessary barrier is worthwhile. If changing the pathway allows a person to contribute, the interesting question is why we were measuring conformity to the pathway instead of capacity to do the eventual work. And Gettysburg is an almost absurdly good place to think about that, because everything around you demonstrates how much position changes outcome. A regiment 100 yards one way instead of another can have a radically different fate. A cannon 10 feet below a crest can survive fire that would destroy it on top. A road intersection can determine where armies collide. A professor's encouragement can help redirect a struggling student. A medical school opening can change an entire career. None of that means outcomes are predetermined. It means systems create possibilities and constraints. And sometimes very small changes upstream produce enormous differences downstream. One caution on the modern Civil War analogy. I'd keep 1861-65 as an analytical comparison rather than assume present American divisions are heading toward the same outcome. The 1860 election really did have four major presidential candidates: Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge and Bell, and secession subsequently produced two rival national governments under Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. What you're physically looking at is what happened after political. Constitutional, economic, racial and territorial conflicts crossed an extraordinary threshold into organized armies holding territory and killing one another. That's a useful historical warning precisely because most political conflict does not have to end there. Keep looking sideways and backward on this part of the tour. Macmillan Wood Seminary Ridge is one of those places where the relationship between cover crest cannon open field opposing ridge becomes much easier to understand with your own eyes than it ever will on a page.
Yes. Yesterday. Oh, how Metro so far away. No, seriously. Yesterday I was at
the cemetery side with the national park historian, and we were facing down from the ridge, from the rock ridge with the wood stakes from that position. Right now, I'm at the Virginia Memorial, the auto stop number 5, I think, right now. And yeah, I'm at the Virginia Memorial right now. And yesterday, I was at the high water mark and at the angle and by the Bryan barn. And so to be here at the Virginia Memorial, literally across it, to see the elevation, but I would say where I am at this monument, it's up a little bit high, but it goes down and then up for quite a bit. You'd have a huge advantage. It's basically nowhere. You'd have a little bit to hide going down a bit, but beyond there, you're in toast land. And I mean, I don't know the range of these guns and the cannons, but you're basically, the moment you get about halfway, my guess is you're in the range. And I can see the white. Oh yeah, I can see the white barn from here. The African American dude's barn is right there, and they wanted to go for the angle of the arrow. I have to get there much later. When I get to 15 and 16, I'm gonna talk about that stuff. But right now, I'm still here at 5, and I'm headed to 6 now. But yeah, to see this. Also, there would have been agriculture in July, so I don't remember if it was harvested or not. And they were growing corn, no soybeans at the time, I think, or it would have been a different kind of agriculture. Right now, it looks like they're doing a little bit of restoration stuff. Yeah, the guy was telling me that on the other side of high water mark and Bry Barn and the angle and by Corpse the Trees, there's an area that they're doing restorative land work, and I told him what I knew about the tall grass stuff and restoration that I'd seen at the various other places. So far, right now, what I see here is a significant amount of white butterflies in this field, like a lot. That's the predominant insect that I see bouncing around, um, which is super cool. There's a couple different types of grasses, but not a significant diversity. Doesn't look like it's been replanted. But a lot of these white butterflies are everywhere. It's a good sign, I think, in general. Um, um, yeah, the interesting thing about the monuments is, so you're saying it was mainly a Confederate was paying for them. It always depends on who's paying for all of this. Who's funding this? Where is the money? Where is the money coming from with all of this? And who's trying to tell the message and control the future knowledge? Because I learned about that at the museum, which I thought was the National Park Museum, but it's not. It's owned by the Conservancy, and they have their own security guards, and they wanted to put a blue wristband on my wrist because I was disabled. And I was like, excuse me? Dude's from Florida going around. It's Florida. What are you doing up here? Who convinced you? I don't understand. I would be like, what was the point of all
Yes, and now that you're standing on the Virginia side of the field, your estimate about the killing ground is basically right, with one important adjustment. They were already in artillery range when they stepped out from Seminary Ridge. Confederate Artillery Commander Edward Porter Alexander later estimated the opposing batteries were roughly 1,400 yards apart. The long-range solid shot, shell, and case shot could work across that distance. When the attackers got to roughly the final 350 yards, Union batteries could switch to canister, effectively turning a cannon into an enormous shotgun. So that dip you can see is important, but it isn't safety. Terrain could temporarily mask parts of formations from direct observation or some flatter trajectories, and then they would reappear as they climbed Cemetery Ridge. At the Emmitsburg Road they hit another awful problem: fences. The Battlefield Trust notes that the post and rail fences forced men to break formation and climb over while under musket and canister fire. Your agricultural instinct is also good. It wasn't the enormous uniform soybean landscape we associate with modern farming. NPS Landscape Research describes the 1,863 farms as a patchwork of relatively small fields containing corn, oats, wheat, rye, hay pasture, potatoes and orchards. By 1,860 local farmers had actually shifted away from wheat somewhat and toward corn, oats, hay and cattle feed because Western grain had become cheaper to transport east. The Kadori fields specifically included wheat, and accounts describe soldiers trampling crops as the armies moved through them. And the white butterflies are an interesting observation, but I wouldn't automatically take abundance alone as proof that restoration is succeeding. If they're the very common cabbage whites you often see bouncing around open eastern fields, that's actually a European species introduced to North America in the 1860s. It thrives in disturbed ground, roadsides, gardens and agricultural landscapes. Without seeing one closely I can't identify yours, but white wings with black forewing tip spots would point strongly toward cabbage white. That's a funny ecological layer. Even the insects you're watching can belong to the post-Civil War transformation of the landscape. And I want to correct one thing from my earlier answer because your question about money is exactly the right one. Gettysburg's monument landscape was not mainly financed by Confederates. Quite the opposite at first. The earliest preservation organization, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, was heavily influenced by Union veterans and Northern funding. NPS records explicitly say this led early preservation, marking and monument building to concentrate almost exclusively on Union positions. Confederate positions remained comparatively unmarked until federal intervention and much later Southern state memorials. That means the landscape you're driving through was created in waves. Northern veterans associations and state legislatures paid for many early regimental monuments. Congress later funded U.S. regular Army monuments and the federal battlefield infrastructure. Southern states generally arrived later and often built one large state monument rather than dozens of individual regimental monuments. The monument you're standing beside is a perfect example. Virginia's legislature appropriated $50,000 for the Virginia Memorial, a very large public expenditure at the time. The Commonwealth appointed a commission to choose the design and site. It became the first Southern state monument on the battlefield, dedicated in 1917, more than half a century after the battle, and NPS records show its design, wording and placement were controversial even among surviving veterans. So your question, who paid? Who decided what went on the pedestal? Who decided where it stood? Who approved the words? Isn't peripheral to studying the monuments. That's part of studying the monuments. A monument tells you at least two histories simultaneously. What happened in 1863, and what somebody decades later wanted people to remember about 1863. There's an especially revealing comparison right where you are. Across that enormous field is the farm of Abraham Bryan, a free black Gettysburg farmer. NPS research says he was born to enslaved parents, acquired his own 12-acre farm, grew corn, wheat and oats and owned livestock. When Confederate forces entered Pennsylvania, he and his family fled because free black residents faced the danger of capture and enslavement. His property was subsequently caught directly in the battle. On one side of your view stands a gigantic 1917 bronze Robert E. Lee funded by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Across the field is the comparatively tiny home of a free black farmer who had to run from Lee's invading army. That juxtaposition tells you an extraordinary amount about memory, money and power without anyone saying a word. And yes, you had the Museum and Visitor Center governance almost right. The organization is the Gettysburg Foundation, not a conservancy. The current Museum and Visitor Center is owned and operated by the Gettysburg Foundation, while functioning as the National Park Service's visitor center and headquarters at Gettysburg. The foundation reported that its museum operations also generated money that it donated back to the NPS. The original public-private agreement contemplated eventual transfer of the facility to the federal government, so the distinction you sensed after the wristband incident is real. The battlefield is a national park, but the building through which most visitors first encounter and interpret it is part of a public-private institutional arrangement. I can't establish from the public material who employed the particular security person you encountered, so I wouldn't automatically attribute that interaction directly to an NPS ranger. And that folds right back into what you've been studying all summer. Handoff nodes aren't only physical, they're institutional. At Gettysburg you can follow the handoffs almost visibly. Former Army Battlefield Burial Ground Veterans Memorial Association, State Legislatures, War Department, National Park Service, Nonprofit Foundation, Historian, Visitor. At every transfer somebody decides what gets preserved, what gets restored, what gets named, what gets funded and what story the next person receives. That's why looking back across the field from Stop 5 after standing at the angle yesterday is such a different experience from simply being told Pickett's charge happened here. You're seeing both ends of the system at once.
Yeah, for sure. I also think it's completely amazing that these states just put their monuments here. So the states paid for it. I saw the Florida monument. I'm like, what are you guys doing up here? The Mississippi monument. And it's even wild that when I was in the museum, there was a hat from the Mexican California War. And you're like, oh, this is. And you get a little upset and you realize it doesn't matter which way you look at it or any way you look at it, war sucks. War is miserable. And this is just, I don't know whether you call the Civil War a blue on blue situation, but this is the worst case scenario of what a nonsensical debate could lead to. But then the question is who's right? Some people wanted to just be left alone, but being left alone involves hurting other people. But when you don't consider the other people, you get back to the disabled thing. Where's the land for the disabled people? Where's the Mason-Dixon line for the disabled people? Where can I go where I'm not going to be hassled and I can get actual accommodations? Because it's hella not Santa Monica, considering they're moving all the people to Bell. You're telling me I'm going to come back to Santa Monica, have to manage to get in the whatever window or time period, schedule whatever, do whatever website, do whatever paperwork. If I manage to get all the way through that, you're going to then send me to the Salvation Army in Bell and pay Bell and Salvation Army to put beds there. You have 35 beds, you're paying the Salvation Army however many millions of dollars. I literally just saw a house with 20-something people in there. Or in Rugby Road, I just saw another house with more than a dozen people in it. I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for any of you guys. Especially when I'm the only one. When even the person who's running, I say, would you like to hear my inventions? And you get no answer. I studied World War II rescue buoys and developed them for container pods and have an entire system and network set up on how to prototype based on sea burn processes that used in the military. I'm the one who took the CERT classes over a decade ago to figure this stuff out. I'm the son of a doctor and a nurse. No, obvious I've been able to figure this out. My dad has the environment of his dad being able to figure out stuff in New Guinea and him growing up in the medicine of the wood as he sits in the wood that had the blood of our Americans on the floor, both sides. How about that? While he walks across the street going by Eisenhower's office. Now, my dad's was born in 1950. My dad was born in 1946. So figuring out the years and stuff is going to be a little interesting. But my rough math, if he's 46, 20, that's 1966. That's right around the time we're talking about. I don't think my grandfather liked Eisenhower. I definitely think he didn't like MacArthur. But this is somebody who actually maybe knew them, considering he was early in the army. He knew about Pearl Harbor 4 days before it happened. That's a fun story to tell people. Yeah, people don't know me or my history or who I am. I think they just see some like editor person that I've managed to convince them that that's the person they want to be with. There's that TV show, The Pretender. It's somewhat like The Pretender and somewhat like A Day After Tomorrow or something, where they spent all the money and resources to try and fix this broken person. Everyone was always telling me I was broken, but nobody was figuring out what I was good at. All right, let's auto tour it up while we're here at auto tour number, I think 6 now, in front of the Mississippi Monument. Considering I've been to the head of the Mississippi and I've crossed the Mississippi. Yeah, right now we're at Pitzer Woods. So tell me about Pitzer Woods and the Warfield House when you get into all this stuff, because I'm going to be moving on from here in my next spot after I listen to the audio part of 6.
We're standing now near Pitzer's Woods at Auto Tour Stop 6 in the Gettysburg battlefield between the Louisiana and Mississippi State Memorials. And it would be near this location on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, that a brigade of Mississippians led by General William Barksdale, a former United States Congressman, time at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill on the northern reaches of the battlefield. In order to get into position to attack, General James Longstreet had to lead his men to this end of the battlefield without being spotted by Union observers on Little Round Top and elsewhere on the battlefield. He had as a guide a man by the name of Captain Samuel Johnston, the same Samuel Johnston that did that early morning reconnaissance that provided Robert E. Lee the information he used to develop his plan. The only problem is both Johnston and Longstreet really had no idea where they were going. By the time they actually began to move towards this position, it was already halfway through the day. They ran into innumerable delays, and at one point, Longstreet had to turn his entire command around lest he be seen by observers on Little Round Top. By the time General James Longstreet's first troops arrived on this stretch of the battlefield, it was near 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of the day had already gone. The Confederate troops that would ultimately occupy this stretch of the ridge were commanded by a Confederate general named Lafayette McLaws. Now, Lafayette McLaws expected to arrive here, see no Union troops in front of him, form his men up along the Emmitsburg Road, and attack down the length of the Emmitsburg Road, towards where Captain Johnston told Lee the left flank of the Union Army lay. Well, rather than finding no one, Lafayette McLaws found a portion of the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, nearly 10,000 men, smack dab in front of him at the peach orchard.
Yikes.
How did those men get there? What were they doing? Well, that's something we're going to explore at Stop 10, the Peach Orchard.
That's so crazy. It's so wild. Whoops. 10,000 dudes. About face.
No, don't turn around. What do you do? Keep
Keep
firing?
Yeah, stop 6 is a really important hinge in the tour, because you're leaving the July 3rd Pickett's charge landscape and beginning to decode Longstreet's July 2nd attack from the place where it was assembled. Pitzer Woods. The woods in front of you weren't incidental scenery. On the afternoon of July 2nd, Longstreet placed his first corps along Warfield Ridge with the left end of his line anchored in Pitzer Woods. Think about that using exactly the terrain logic you've been noticing. The woods provide concealment and organization space. Thousands of men can get into position behind trees rather than standing exposed in those huge agricultural fields you're looking across. Earlier that day, Union troops actually probed into Pitzer Woods. The first U.S. sharpshooters encountered Confederate troops gathering there, giving the Union some information that something substantial was developing on its left. Later, Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade was in this General Assembly area before making its famous and devastating attack toward the Peach Orchard. So with the Mississippi Monument sitting there, there's a geographical reason for it. Those Mississippi soldiers weren't commemorated at some arbitrary pretty location. This portion of the Confederate line was part of the actual launch area for their July 2nd attack. And watch what happens as you continue toward Stop 7, Warfield Ridge. The geography transitions from Woods Concealment Ridge Observation Open Agricultural Ground Peach Orchard Wheatfield Devil's Den Round Tops. Longstreet's assaults began from this general ridge around 4 p.m. and moved east against that whole Union left. That's almost exactly the simulation phenomenon you were describing earlier. Spawn staging area, line formation, objective, visibility, elevation, range, obstruction. Except these were actual people trying to maneuver through fences, crops, smoke and artillery. And then the Warfield House changes what this landscape means. This is one of the houses I especially wanted you to know about given everything you've been thinking about. James and Eliza Warfield were Black Gettysburg residents. Their home was a tiny 1.5-story, 2-room stone farmhouse. James operated a successful blacksmith business. They had only acquired the property within about a year of the battle. When the Confederate Army approached Gettysburg, the Warfields fled. Not merely because there was going to be a battle. They had a particularly terrifying reason. As African Americans living in Pennsylvania, they were vulnerable to capture by Confederate forces and removal southward into slavery. The NPS explicitly identifies fear of capture as the reason the family fled. Now look at the landscape you're physically driving through. On July 2nd, Confederate soldiers occupied the dollars. And this is where your earlier question, who gets a monument, who pays for it, and whose story gets transmitted, becomes almost painfully visible. You can have an enormous 20th century Mississippi State monument commemorating Confederate soldiers towering over this landscape. Nearby is a little stone house belonging to a black resembles its 1863 appearance. That work was completed in 2020. And there's another fantastic node connection. Pitzer Woods itself took its name from the Pitzer family, whose nearby farm eventually became part of what is now the Eisenhower National Historic Site. NPS historical documentation follows Samuel Pitzer continuing to farm that property after the Civil War. So even right here you've got Pitzer Farm, Confederate Assembly Area, Warfield Farm, Black Civilian Flight, Peach Orchard, Assault, Battlefield Preservation, Eisenhower landscape. That's what keeps happening to you at Gettysburg. You tug on one geographic thread and it refuses to remain a Civil War story. As you leave Stop 6 for Warfield Ridge, look ahead rather than only at the monuments. You're about to see why Longstreet could hide an army back here and then send it spilling out into the open. The boundary between the woods and those fields is itself part of the weapon system.
I don't want to meet the spider that made that spider web. Holy shit. Yeah. Wow. That was a very large. I had to back up and double take on how big that thing was. Okay, so that spider's web was looked to be like was a funnel at one point, like a collapsed funnel. But it must have been There's an old covered bridge over there that I was thinking of trying to go to, but I got side. I missed it. Okay, well, at least I'm at the right place. If that was the... No. Oh man, I literally was right here. Well, what I'm trying to do is go to Eisenhower's house, but it's behind this fence. So I was like, okay, GPS says you go to Eisenhower's house this way, right here. But then this says, no, don't do that. So, oh, that one's very tall. This is probably the tallest one we've seen so far. That's cool. Maybe I'll come here before I leave. Side quest. We're on the Gettysburg auto tour, but we're on a quick little side quest. Side quest! Well, it's the second president's house of the tour. Kinda cool. Kinda cool. Kinda cool. I'll dig it. Is it my second president's house? Yes. I was just at the Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's house in Long Island. And here I am at Eisenhower's house in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The first house was where my grandparents and everyone lived. And this is where my dad went to school. So I'm just kind of tripping out about all this. This is crazy. Is this real? Am I really doing this? I think this is fine. Oh, my shit. I shall leave this place better than I found it, says Eisenhower. Oh man, that's a trip. Oh, oh, okay. Okay. Wow. Dude, the car is literally the best accommodation, one of the best accommodation devices ever made. Look at this. Look what I'm doing. Oh, I should probably not have done this though. I've gone to a dead end of something. But here we are. They're repairs. National Park workers at work. Look at this. Okay. How else do you think we met the dude fixing the pier? Yeah, I'm leaving. Goodbye. As the National Park workers, NPS, they've got their saw. They've got the old fence they're replacing. Look at them go. I mean, maybe just that area was bad. Why isn't the rest having replaced? Or brings some great questions, man. This is fantastic. I loved seeing this shit. Are they coming after me? Oh my god, they're coming after me. No, they're not. They're just walking slowly. Thank you guys. Always wave. Even if you're doing something wrong, just keep waving. It's wow, look at us go. What are we growing here? Soybeans? God damn. I mean, I just drank a whole bunch of soy milk, but I all can barely doubt that I ate the soy milk that I was from here. You go to any of the like coffee shops or any of the smoothie places and you ask for a smoothie or soy milk, they don't have it, which is so funny because they're doing and growing tons of soy. How did you guys go back the other way? Did you make a U-turn in there? How did Minnie come around and face forward down that road? And the lighting is great right now. Super soft. Look at this. The lighting on me is beautiful. Alright. Green car, blue hair. Just wait for cloudy days. The Eisenhower home. It's up there. That's cool.